So the idea for this talk came from a book by Sarah Sheridan. It's called Where Are the Women? It's a book which looks at Scottish women who've been relegated to the sidelines of history, and she points out that there are more statues to animals than there are women in our native Edinburgh, and even then most of the statues are of Queen Victoria. When glancing through the Arcadian on Thursday, I spotted a story in the From Our Archives section, and it detailed a 65th wedding anniversary of a couple for Sharpensea. We called it the Ruby anniversary. Today we would call it their Blue Sapphire anniversary, and it was from 75 years ago. So the 14th of November 1946. The story tells us of an esteemed couple resident in Balfour village. 65 years of married life is something which does not happen to very many people and is therefore a matter for very sincere congratulations. The couple had received many telegrams of congratulation, including one from the King and Queen, and the story continues. Two people who are so well known in Orkney and who are so much respected must have been in the thoughts of their many friends that Sunday. May they long be spared to enjoy each other's company. Their names? Mr. and Mrs. William Tinch. She definitely existed. There's a photo, but despite being so well known, we are not to know her name. So when I started thinking about women in Orkney, to get back to the actual talk, because that was an aside, I started by looking at my own book collection. I've got a fairly healthy collection of over 1,200 titles, and I had to catalogue what I had because I was buying duplicates and I wasn't keeping up with everything I owned. And one of the categories I gave myself was people, specific autobiographies or histories that were about a person. So for the purposes of tonight, I expanded that out to include other categories. And I came up with about 55 books written about actual people or families. This is not scientific, it's my own classification, but it's not far off. Of these 55 results, there were included a who's who and a couple of compendiums, some earls, some adventurers, and 3 family genealogies. And in my own collection, over 1,200 titles, I only found 5 books about women, 3 autobiographies, 1 biography, and an artist retrospective. And I was really rather surprised because female writers feature quite heavily. Bill Hewison's excellent Who Was Who in Orkney contains information on 725 individuals I counted. Women appear 60 times. However, 2 women appear 3 times and 3 women appear twice. That's their maiden names, their pen names. St Treadwell even appears under S for Saint. So that leaves us with 53 women. Of these 53 women, 19 were Vikings, 2 were witches, and on 24 occasions, the woman's first role in life, no matter what job she did or what she achieved, was to be a wife or a mother or a sister or a daughter or a grandmother or a granddaughter. One woman's forename was Miss, another had the rather unique middle name of Walter. It's a good read. I've discounted the Vikings. If you want to learn about them, then I can direct you to some folk. And I'm not going to talk about witches, as that's been done before, and it's really not in the spirit of this talk, where the women get the top billing. So this is not a definitive look. I'll have missed somebody that you really want to hear about. I hope that you'll learn about at least 1 or 2 that you might have passed you by. And I'm not speaking about anybody living, generally. They're all Orkney born, with I think 1 or 2 maybe exceptions. And if you've got anybody you would like to add to this list, I'd be really happy to speak to you about it. And this has also been a desktop exercise. I've not consulted the Orkney Archive directly. And before I go further, I have to talk about a couple of women who've done so much for Orkney's heritage. Firstly, Laura Grimmond. She was one of the founders of the Heritage Society, and in 1968 she led the campaign to save Pabdell House from being torn down to make way for the school hostel, which of course is new at the end of its life. Her bequest also allowed us, Heritage Society, to purchase and restore the houses on the Strand. She became councillor for Firth and Harry, and she became a chair of the OIC Housing Committee. And it was because of Laura's interest in the built heritage of Orkney that Orkney Heritage Society instigated the Grimmond Award, which today is an occasional award for development which contributes to the architectural heritage of Orkney. She was married. Her husband was known for his moderate political success. In Laura's obituary, it notes that one of her concerns was the representation of women and the promotion of women's rights. Good lass. Another OHS luminary is Marjorie Linklater, and she's another OHS award. The Marjorie Linklater Award is given to school pupils in the 5th or 6th years of study, or those at Orkney College of equivalent age, for a short piece of creative writing. Marjorie was another founder member and chair of the Heritage Society between 1977 and 1981. And it was while she was in this role that she was at the forefront of the vanguard against the unsuccessful uranium mining in Orkney. She also persuaded the oil industry to fund a full-time archaeologist for Orkney. I wonder what happened there. In her obituary, she's quoted as often saying to her moderately successful husband, "Why do you keep saying change is bad? All change is for the best, even when it's for the worst." She helped in the founding of the Peer Arts Centre, the St Magnus Festival, and she was responsible for the creation of the John Smith Foy, which is the celebration of Orkney's considerable artistic heritage. Now, I've categorised everybody that follows into rough sections, so it's only right that I start off with literature, though the ladies appear in no particular order. And I am going to start with a personal favourite, Harriet Campbell. Though she spent much of her life travelling, Harriet Campbell had an obvious affection for Orkney, and Ernest Marwick tells us that she spoke many languages, and there are many mentions of France and Italy in her writing, and the archive holds a letter written to Harriet in Italian. Her papers make it obvious that she spent much time in Edinburgh, and in fact spent much of her younger childhood living with her granny in Edinburgh. The letters are obviously written by her granny to her mother on her behalf, and each one is at pains to point out that she is not lonely at all, not one bit. Harriet was the only child of Dr. Campbell, a specialist in mental disorders, and her mother was Janet Ann, known as Nenny Clouston on Nestis. Most of her later life was spent at the old home of her grandfather at Nestis in Hurry, and she was described in the 1949 An Anthology of Orkney Verse, which incidentally is the first time that George Mackay-Brown appeared in print, as having an attractive personality enriched by a delightful sense of humour. She was very interested in helping out young folks, and I was only able to track down a single image in which Harriet appears, and I contacted the Guild Guiding Orkney website, it was a very long time ago now, to see if they would have a photo of Harriet, and I was rewarded with both a photograph and a scan for their minute book. I'm not even very sure which one she is, but I'm assuming she's the older of the two here, otherwise the timeline doesn't quite fit. Next to her writing, her favourite occupation was painting, and I have seen some of her work. Certainly it's better than anything I could produce, but it's not commercial quality. And although I don't always like Harriet's writing, there are glimmers that remind me she's a worthy of a place in the canon of Orkney's writers, and here's why. This is one of my favourite poems, I have to tell you. It's Murbister for me. There's Murbister and Narston and Corrigal and Broch, there's Corston and there's Grimeston and Hurston by the loch, there's folk in all the townships as there's fishes in the sea, but the lave can bide in their own bit, it's Murbister for me. There's happy homes in Harry where the hills lie all around, there's Hinderfjord and Skifflehune and all around peak ground. There's folk in all the townships as there's fishes in the sea, but the lave can bide in their own bit, it's Murbister for me. There's lots of lochs in Harry, there's Boscoy and the Burn, there's Ginion and there's Padigan and Moss where I turn, but the folk and all the townships like the fishes of the sea think the Rainbrigstein's the best, and so it's Murbister for me. There's Harry lads 100 who work the land themselves, they're honest and they're mannerly for all blade always tales. There's good folk in the parishes as there's fishes of the sea, there's Orford, Ham and Dernis, but the Harry lads for me. Moving on to Chrissy Costy, another favourite. In the foreword to her collected Dialect Tales, which was written originally in 1976, reprinted in 1995, it tells us that Orkney's dialect had only been used consistently as a vehicle for stories, narratives and poems by two writers of acknowledged distinction until that point, Walter Trill-Dennison and Chrissy Costy. Thankfully, that tradition has been well and truly resurrected by today's writers. I didn't attend the live launch of the Gauster Glims and Videorums writing for 40 Voices, but I did watch the live Zoom hosted by the National Library of Scotland, and I was more than a bit chuffed to see the fully female lineup with Orkney dialect front and centre. Christina Mackay-Costy was born in Campbell on the 6th of August 1902. She grew up at St Catherine's Place and in adult life moved just around the corner from me folks on Williburn Road, where she saw her days. Her working life was spent as a shorthand typist in the law firm McCrae & Robertson, which has led to some describing her as a spinster lawyer writing dialect version of spare time, which is neither kind nor accurate. Her writing is lyrical, entertaining, sad, happy, funny, informative. I am a fan. In her actual spare time, Chrissy spent time with friends, amongst whom were Ernest and Jeanette Marwick, Robert Brendel and George Mackay-Brown. it was Chrissy's work that kicked off my project for the Heritage Society back in 2010, the Eerie Orkney dialect. And I'm going to read another poem, Hush. I won't read any more, it's just Harriet and Chrissy's. And it is speech. Don't say no, say now. And don't say coo, say cow. And the bairns all shouted and roared with laughter when I said after instead of after. She gave me the clout because I said live instead of the palm of my hand, and she hauled me gansy and gave me a ride when I could not understand. Your English is terrible, boy, she roared. I just can't comprehend it. But I wasna speaking English, so the poor soul didn't ken it. So out before the door I gaed to cool my heels, said she, saying Ervo and Hickson and Bat and Dunder, I really feel I could take you asunder, you horrid unteachable boy. Some thought about it all, and I'll hae the best of the bargain. I'll tak me claes in my money box and just gang him till Bergen. And Raggy Luseland wrote the definitive book on Chrissy's Bodle in 2011, which you can still get from the Acadian Bookshop. Marjorie Ski. Marjorie was the daughter of shipmaster Andrew Ski. These are the kinds of biographical details you're given when you look for a woman. You'll see that there's a theme appearing here. And her mother was Marjorie Anderson, whose job it was to be Andrew Ski's wife. Marjorie married Robert Corrigal in 1946, she did not, in 1846, but in the 1851 census, she's listed as a widow, and she's living with her parents and brother in Main Street, Stromness. And according to her will, she owned property, some of which was tenanted and had servants. Her cousin, William Robertson, he was living in Birkenhead at the time of her death, inherited much of her property in Stromness, and among her other beneficiaries were her ski relatives in Dermis, the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, and the deserving poor of Stromness. The deserving poor. Whoever heard of undeserving poor? Marjorie gave instructions that the remainder of her estate was to be paid to the magistrates of the borough of Stromness for the purpose of erecting and maintaining a free library for the borough and parish of Stromness under the Public Libraries Act of 1887. And she is commemorated by a plaque on the end of the old library's gable lane, though it's mostly illegible today, but she is still remembered through the Marjorie Ski Room in the new library at the Pierhead. The librarian and caretaker post at Stromness Public Library was once a live-in position with accommodation above the library. When the building opened in 1906, the salary of £6 was offered along with 2 rooms, firing and lighting and taxes paid. In 1955, the salary had risen to £104 and accommodation included a bathroom. The first 6 librarians were men, but the following 5 in the old building were women, 2 of whom moved over to the new building, and 1 of whom became a PhD in August 2021. Yippee! Marjorie was buried with her parents and her brother in the Wearmouth Cemetery. Mary Brunton, she was a Balfour. She was born in Bury. She didn't benefit from much in the way of a formal education, but her mother taught her music, French and Italian. But at the age of 21, she eloped and she married the Reverend Alexander Brunton, settling far away from her disapproving parents in Bury in Bolton near Haddington. Her health can't have been too good because after she moved to Edinburgh, they travelled to Harrogate in 1809 to take the waters. She was first published in 1811 with a novel called Self-Control, which went through numerous editions and was even translated into French. And it came to the attention of Jane Austen, who repeatedly wrote about it, even claiming to use some of Mary's themes in her own later work. She wrote a second novel in 1814 called Discipline, which also went on to multiple editions. And in 1815, following, ironically, a move to London, Mary started to learn Gaelic, which she planned to incorporate into her third unfinished novel. She died too young at the age of 40. She's rather forgotten today, but for a brief period, she outsold Jane Austen, and she was the pride of the Scottish literary scene. Her works are freely available online. I attended a National Library of Scotland online talk this week about women writers, and she was mentioned. Henrietta Greenwater wrote her book Memories of an Orkney Family when she was 85. It's free to download from the Orkney Singers website on Orkney Communities. She was born at Cumleybank in Harry, though she grew up in Orford, and she worked at dressmaking on Junction Road in Cargill for much of her life. She was published a lot, but under the pen names Thorold or Islander, and she was also published throughout Scotland. She enjoyed her anonymity and even wrote poems and stories for her Sunday school classes, but she never let on who actually wrote them. In her obituary written by Ernest Marwick, he wrote of her, She loved to hear or tell a good story, particularly if it highlighted the individuality and drollery of the Arcadian character. She was a leading alto in the choir of the Paterson Kirk, that's the OIC one-stop shop. She had a remarkable memory, which meant she remembered many ancient Orkney songs, which were recorded and are available on the Kister Riches website. And it's from here that she came to my attention, as she was an important part of the Big Orkney Song Project, which I was part of from 2011. She sang in dialect. By the time she was recorded, she was an older lady, and if you can imagine older ladies doing their kirk singing, you'll know it wasn't exactly operatic. It didn't matter though, because you could hear her passion, her memory and her life coming out in the songs. And we'll come back to Henrietta later on. Agnes Scherer from Kirkwall lived a tragically short but packed life. She was transformed into Anne Scott Moncrieff through her marriage in 1934 to George, who she met while they were both chasing a journalistic career in London. As a youngster, Anne had been pretty game for any adventure. She swam in the sea year-round. She was a woman well ahead of her time in that respect. Boat fishing in any weather and playing lots of hockey. Her education at Kirkwall Borough School led to an apprenticeship at the Arcadian, and her spirit of adventure was truly tested when she was chosen to be the reporter on the scene for Ted Fresson's first flight across the Penton Firth in 1931. There would have been lots of fresh air, but I don't think it would have been especially warm or comfy. In the 2015 Orkney International Science Festival, Anne's son Gavin proposed to toast their memory, and he said that despite his mother's look of apprehension, even fear, there's a determination that in spite of everything she was going to do it, no, come what may. In her subsequent article in the paper, she speaks of her initial fright very well at the same science festival event. Howie Firth thought her article was responsible for encouraging the Orkney public to embrace the idea of flying, and there's been no stopping us ever since. Under the headline, Our Flying Girl Report, she told the story of her flight. She reported, at 11 a.m. on Saturday, Flying Officer E.E. Fresson and his engineer Mr. J. War landed at Kirkwall from Wick in their 110 horsepower Avro biplane. At 3 p.m, they carried off with them, possibly because of her wistful eye, possibly for ballast, an extra passenger, me. She described Kirkwall from the air, feeling that it seemed more insignificant than when she approached by sea or land. The cathedral loses its dignity, she writes, and is uniform with other buildings in the town. The Bishop's Palace is a rotund little pepper pot, the streets are slits. Only the pier, elongated, graceful and flanked by ships, and the sweep of the crescent looks well. Her writing was certainly impressive. It was impressive enough to attain a job in London's Fleet Street at just 18. Her marriage to George meant a welcomed move back to Scotland, where they started their family, so money was tight. And this was at a time when laws were put in place to discriminate against or even actually prevent women from getting paid work, married women from getting paid work during the time of the Depression. The arguments usually centred around men being the breadwinners, the women should stay at home and look after the bairns. Any work a woman took on would be taking the work away from a man. Despite this, Anne managed to gain work with the BBC. She wrote scripts and adapted novels for the BBC Radio Education Service, and it was at this time that she wrote her 3 novels, though her novel Anti-Robo was initially rejected for being too Scottish. She also produced a quantity of poetry, though they were mostly unpublished. As well as being the subject for the 1 o'clock toast at the Science Festival, Anne was the subject of the 2020 George Mackay Brown Memorial Lecture, which you can watch on the GMB Fellowship website. So she really should be better remembered. Florence Marion, or Floss McNeill. She was a folklorist. She was born in Ham. She was known as Floss by her friends and her family. Her parents were Free Church minister Daniel and Jessie Janet Dewar, and after graduating from Glasgow, she travelled across Europe working as an English assistant and assistant anglais, which sounds much posher, in France and then Germany. And when she came back to Scotland in 1912, she was appointed organiser of the Scottish Federation of Women's Suffrage Societies, who had meetings across Scotland. There were branches in both Kirkwall and Stromness. In 1913, She became secretary of the Association for Moral and Social Hygiene, which during the first decades of the 20th century became the most prominent of the abolitionist organisations in Britain, and who called for the repeal of the solicitation laws, the series of statutes used by police all over Britain to control street prostitution. Although she went abroad after the First World War for a few years, she returned to Scotland to become a freelance journalist and writer. Her first book, Iona, A History of the Island, was published in 1920 and it reached its 7th edition in 1991. She made many allegiances with leading literary lights of Scotland, and in 1932 she founded the Clan MacNeill Association of Scotland. So she might have been slightly alarmed at the 2015 findings that the MacNeill clan of Barra, who claimed to have been descended from Ireland's greatest King Niall of the 9 Hostages, were actually just descended from the Vikings. Who isna? She was politically active and she became vice president of the Scottish National Party. Her writing career continued apace. She joined the staff of the Scottish National Dictionary Association in 1921, which is a fabulous read and a good way to lose a few words. There are 2 books which cemented Floss's reputation. The first in 1929, when she became the authority on Scottish culinary matters with the publication of The Scots Kitchen, Its Traditions and Lore with Old-Time Recipes. It was the first of several works on the theme of Scottish food, but The Scots Kitchen is an important work. And then in 1957, she produced the first in what would become 4 volumes in the series of The Silver Bough, a 4-volume study of the national and local festivals of Scotland. The first volume covered Scottish folklore and folk beliefs. The second, third and fourth volumes provided a calendar of Scottish national festivals. Her only fictional work was a thinly disguised autobiographical novel, The Road Home, in 1932. And in 1962, she was awarded an MBE. And this talk has cost me lots of money because I realised I didn't have all 4 copies of The Silver Bough, so I had to buy them. Bessie Skee, she was known to a whole generation of Arcadian readers as Countrywoman, where she wrote from the early 60s until her death. Before that, she wrote for the Orkney Herald before it closed. She was known locally as Bessie Grieve, and she published under her maiden name. And she published a number of books, writing mainly about the natural world and life in Orkney. She was born in Sharpensea, and when she married, she moved to Harry, and she lived in the house now occupied by her granddaughter, also a cat lover. And I feel it important to tell you that the kitten on the front of a countrywoman's diary is called Charlie. She spent 2 periods in Australia, but she continued to write a weekly column about life in Orkney. And something I found particularly interesting is that in the 1960s, when she was already quite established as a writer, she attended night school along with her man, studying for higher English. Bessie wrote from a young age. And in the first year of World War II, she wrote about a major raid over Scapa Flow. In a few minutes, firing started fiercely. Tracer bullets climbed upwards. Shells burst in an enormous barrage, a great black line in the sky. A few pale searchlights swept the sky, great flashes from the direction of Linus, whole batteries opening up at once. Our lighted planes scoured about high above the shell barrage. "There's a Jerry," I shouted. There were 3 Germans over Kirkwall. As it grew darker, the firing increased. The searchlights were brilliant. "Look, a German machine gunning." An enemy plane, going like smoke, was rat-a-tat-tatting with his tail gun over Kirkwall. A shell burst right behind him. He went off then. It eased a little, then increased. Crash, bang, rattle, rat-a-tats right above us. We didn't see it, but we found out that a British plane engaged a German when that machine gunning went. Suddenly, the west side searchlight swept across the sky, and in the beam was an enormous plane, a great bomber, flying for its life so low down that one could easily have hit it with a shotgun. 4 great engines under the wings, though there were no German 4-engined aircraft, and red fire shooting down from the tail gun right between Hannatoft and Old Manse. We lost sight of it. Then our 4 Sharpensea searchlights met and crossed overhead. An armed trawler in the bay below us fired. A really lovely scene. Searchlights playing over an almost clear sky, lighted planes humming about, shells bursting in the beams of the searchlights, tracer bullets climbing upwards, flashes from big guns to the south. Carness Battery opened with a roar. A faint red light appeared at the aerodrome. A pom-pom gun went crack, crack. Planes droned. Germans! We heard the men Elwick Bank light shouting. The officer's car went past again. More bullets, more flashes, more searchlights. The lapwings were crying, and above it all, a pale crescent moon looked down. It was weirdly beautiful. Adventurers. This first adventurer, Eliza Ann Fraser, she really doesn't fit into the same class as the others in this presentation. I wouldn't say she was a good guy at all. It's widely believed that Eliza Fraser was Arcadian and lived in the house in Dundas Street in Stromness, but there's little to actually back this up. Born in probably Derbyshire as Eliza Slack, she married Captain James Fraser before 1821, and they certainly lived in Stromness for some time. When Captain Fraser was made master of the Stirling Castle, they made the unusual, certainly to our eyes today, choice to leave behind their 14-year-old daughter and 2 young sons of 10 and 6 in the care of the Stromness Presbyterian minister, Reverend Peter Lermonth, a relative stranger to them. A pregnant 37-year-old Eliza and her 54-year-old husband set sail from Stromness and they headed towards Australia, where 7 months later the Stirling Castle was wrecked on a reef. Eliza would lose her baby, her husband's nephew, and much of the crew. Initially, the voyage was a success. She offloaded her cargo, but it was the next leg that proved so treacherous. And on the night of 21st May 1836, the vessel hit a coral reef and it foundered off the northeastern coast of Australia. Taken to 2 lifeboats, the 19 survivors headed south. On day 3, Eliza gave birth to a baby, which died shortly afterwards. On day 5, they reached a small island where they regrouped, Eliza being the one who found and gathered water enough for them. After a month, the loss of one of the boats and much of the crew in it, some were rescued, Eliza's lifeboat reached land, where they did not receive a warm welcome. And it's here that the story begins to take on some slightly mythical qualities, and some say that Eliza fabricated and sensationalized much of her story. One of the many claims made by her was the harsh treatment at the hands of the Aboriginal tribesmen and women, including the stripping of her clothing and the application of a charcoal and grease solution to her skin. This solution was probably what saved her from savage sunburn or heat stroke, and it probably saved her life. She was given burns to nurse, but she was so inept, the local women got a bit fed up with her. Different accounts tell us that her husband had survived to this point, but that he died of being speared, of starvation, of injury, or of infection. Feeling herself enslaved and taken hostage, Eliza was pretty down in the dumps. Her fortunes were immediately renewed, though, when she was rescued by John Graham. Again, different stories account for his appearance. He was either part of a party put together by a commanding officer who had met with 3 crewmen who had managed to find their way to the Australian mainland seeking help, or he had lived with natives for many years and came to hear of this white woman through the grapevine. She was rescued along with several other members of the Stirling Castle crew who refuted much of what she claimed, including stories of cannibalism. When she was taken to mainland Australia, the story blew up and she became quite a celebrity, receiving a large amount of money raised through public subscription after hearing her horrors. While she waited for a ship to take her back to Orkney, she met and secretly married Captain Alexander John Green on the 3rd of February 1837. This is probably less than 8 months after her husband's death. They eventually set sail, first off arriving in London, where once again the story was sensationalised and Eliza got yet more public cash. So this time, the money was sent directly to Orkney for her burns. She didn't get her own mitts in it. And this is because she had kept quiet about her second marriage, her Australian loot, and her abandoned Arcadian burns. The couple eventually reached Stromness. Unclear if the plaque on the house in Stromness refers to her habitation before or after her so-called adventure. And the plaque donated some Maori fish hooks to the Stromness Museum. They were still living in Stromness in 1838 when the Sheriff Substitute of Orkney received a report of threats of violence against them by William Taylor and Clementina Mellish. Both were cautioned under penalty of 40 shillings. Orkney archives say that they aren't listed in 1841 census for Stromness, so it's possible they'd left Orkney by this point. It seems that they sailed for a life in New Zealand and they took Eliza's burns with them. Certainly, a gravestone to her oldest son, James, and his subsequent members of his family still exists in Dunedin in New Zealand. Eliza herself possibly died in Melbourne in a carriage accident in 1858. As early as 1841, accounts of her life appeared in a book which had negative effects on Aboriginal settler relations in Australia, and the questions surrounding her rescue and its aftermath has led to lasting controversy. Descendants of the Aborigines resented the way their ancestors' attempts to help the castaways were misrepresented. In 1976, another book appeared along with others, and acclaimed artist Sidney Nolan used her as a muse for a group of 12 paintings. In the 20th century, historians re-examined her story, and in 1976 it was turned into a movie, which was the first in Australia's history that cost over £1 million to make. It only recouped half that amount at the box office. Its director claimed the film's cost had been caused by the press to misrepresent the movie as a serious epic when it was always intended to be a comedy. Well, Isabel Gunn is altogether a much more inspirational woman than her Eliza Fraser. Isabel really knew her own mind, and she wasn't going to be confined by the conventions of the day. She lived in an era when Orkney's men and boys were clearing off wholesale to Hudson's Bay to work for the company. Isabel obviously fancied a bit of adventure herself, so she disguised herself as a man, gave herself a new name, John Fobister, and signed up with the company. She was possibly following her brother, possibly not. Work in Hudson's Bay wasn't for the faint-hearted, even though you could make sometimes between 4 and 6 times what you could possibly ever expect to make at home. They had to endure mosquito swarms in the summer, freezing winter conditions that would test the hardest of the hard. Food was often hard to come by, and sanitation was non-existent. Working on the Canadian boats, running supplies, collecting furs, and hoisting 90-pound loads on their backs, it was dangerous physical work, and it was too hard for most men. Isabel quickly distinguished herself. Her canoe treks and expeditions through the most remote stretches of Canada saw her travelling some 1,800 miles between remote trading posts. Hugh Henney, who led one of the brigades that Gunn travelled with to Pembina, wrote that she worked at anything and was well liked by the rest of the men. She even earned herself a pay rise for performing her duties willingly and well. Bear in mind that in all the time working for the company, she was pretending to be a man. So there must have been at least one occasion when she threw off her breeches, because this is where the story takes an interesting turn. On December 29th, 1807, she excused herself from work with stomach pains. She begged the head of the trading post, Alexander Henry, to let her rest in his house by the fire, and Henry's journal notes his reaction. I was surprised at the fellow's demand. However, I told him to sit down and warm himself. I returned to my room, where I had not been long before he sent one of my own people requesting the favour of speaking with me. Accordingly, I stepped down to him and was much surprised to find him extended out upon the hearth, uttering most dreadful lamentations. He stretched out his hand towards me, and in a pitiful tone of voice begged my assistance, and requested I would take pity upon a poor, helpless, abandoned wretch, who was not of the sex I had every reason to suppose, but was an unfortunate Orkney girl, pregnant and actually in childbirth. In saying this, she opened her jacket and displayed to my view a pair of beautiful round white breasts. Isabel Gunn was having a baby. Henry's journal continued, in about an hour, she was safely delivered of a fine boy, and that same day she was conveyed home in my carriole, where she soon recovered. She claimed the father was one John Scarth. Certainly the two did share postings, but it's unclear if the relationship was consensual. Was it an affair or was it blackmail? We'll probably never know. In early 1808, Gunn and her son James were ordered to return to Fort Albany in Ontario, and upon her arrival she was no longer allowed to work with the men, but rather was offered work as a washerwoman. Although the boss at Albany seemed sympathetic towards Isabel, Hudson's top brass didn't want to be seen to supporting a woman of bad character. So against their will, Gunn and her bairn were returned to Scotland after a year. Unmarried and considered ruined, Isabel was slightly ostracised from her family back here home. She lived in poverty, working as a stocking and mitten maker until her death in 1861, aged 81, and she's buried somewhere in a pauper's grave at Wearbeth in Stromness. There are various literary, musical and filmed tributes and tales to Isabel's memory. I think the best one is a play written by Anya King with Jennifer Wrigley playing Isabel. It's available via Tom and Rhonda Muir's Orkneyology website. Margaret Humphrey, born Margaret Allen. She was the daughter of William Allen and Margaret Wilson. She married George Humphrey on the 9th of June, 1791, and according to the 1821 census, George was a teacher. The couple had 13 bairns between 1792 and 1815, though we know from her letters that by 1837 she was a widow, that her third boy Robert had died as a child, and that her daughter Mary Dunn had recently died, leaving a family of small children. Margaret's surviving sons were scattered in all directions as the necessity of earning a living took them away from home. Thomas was in an apothecary shop in Halifax. I don't know if that is in Canada or England. John was a sailor, James was a doctor in Mexico, later Boston, Alexander is in New Orleans, and Rob was a herring fisher. Other unnamed sons were clearly a source of worry for Margaret, as in a letter to her son Charles, she warns him not to be like some of your brothers who ruined themselves by their extravagance and keeping company with those who loved their bottle. She had at least 2 daughters, Mary, who had died, and Jean. We know a bit about her son, Charles, who had joined the Hudson's Bay Company in 1833 as a seaman on the Hudson's Bay Company vessel Prince of Wales, before working his way up the ranks and making master of the Eagle by the age of 26. After the ship became icebound, the captain and the first mate died, harbingers of the cold weather of the 1830s that caused Charles's mother to create the hospital, containing 26 patients, all part of the surviving whalers, whose 20 ships had become crushed in the Arctic ice. Margaret's 1837 letter to Charles makes it clear that she'd fallen on hard times. She complains that she'd spent a life of care and woe, and that none of her large family had come to assist her in her old age. She hadn't earned any money for 4 months, and had it not been for Thomas sending her money, she would have been in a very bad position. A letter from John Bakey to Thomas Balfour MP, dated 24th of February 1836, gives us the name of 2 of the ships, the Lady Jane and the Viewforth, which were stuck in the ice in the Davis Straits, and he says that people from the ships were removed to the shore, where Mrs. Humphrey's house was fitted up as a hospital, which contained 26 or 28. Margaret herself is described as a widow in her 60s when she wrote to 27-year-old Charles, and to support herself, she had leased a house in 1836 to use as a hospital. So from this piece of information, it appears that she didn't own that house in Stromness, she just leased it. Charles didn't have much luck as a seafarer over the course of his career, and in 1846, after several fits of drunkenness, his captaincy was rescinded. Margaret tried unsuccessfully to solicit his reinstatement in England, but he drops out of the record after this. His brother Thomas fared somewhat better. He left a bequest for the benefit of the poor or destitute children of Stromness for educational or other benevolent purposes. A nephew, James Humphrey of Boston, disputed the will, claiming the money should have gone to him, and there's a copy of the Humphrey bequest in the archives, but as I'm more interested in Thomas's mother than him, I didn't go into this any further. An extract from the diary of Wally Scott, dated January 1835. He was one of the whalers that survived after his ship was stuck in the ice, recalls how, when we got back to Stromness, they put me and the other 4 into Mrs. Humphrey's house. In the 1821 census return, Margaret Humphrey is listed as a sick nurse, aged 65, and in the 1851 census return, she is listed as a widow and a midwife, aged 78. So there's clearly some confusion about just exactly how old she was, and there's very little information about the hospital she set up. In 2019, the story was turned into a play by Stephen Dick under the A Play, a Pie and a Pint banner, and it played in March 2019. I'd very much like to have seen it. Margaret Manson Graham was born as one of 5 to Isabella Manson and John Graham, weaver and crofter in Orford. Her initial education in Orford led to becoming a pupil teacher at 16 and eventual qualification as a teacher. She then moved to Glasgow to train as a nurse, and upon ordination volunteered for mission service in Calabar, Nigeria, by joining the Women's Foreign Mission Committee. Here she used her nursing skills to help crew members off the British trading ships, and when the government built a hospital at Duketown for its officials and white traders, she was asked to take over as a sister in charge. The St Margaret Teaching Hospital is still in operation today. In addition, she treated to the sick of the native population. In 1901, a military campaign was launched against Aro tribe, and she tended to the casualties at Itu, the Aro heartland, Arachuka and Bendi. She was awarded the Africa General Service Medal with clasps, and in 1906 she was appointed a serving sister on the roll of the Order of the Hospital of St John of Jerusalem, which is the medal on the right, which I think is just absolutely gorgeous. She became distressed by the Aro subjugation, so in 1919, 2 years after retiring, she offered her nursing services. She returned to West Africa as a missionary nurse based at the Calabar Slessor Memorial Home. Her work was varied from stitching knife wounds to birthing babies. Twin babies were regarded with superstition, so she supervised the building of a sanctuary for outcast women and babies, and she created a dispensary where she funded the medicines herself. She adopted an orphan, Okorafo, and trained an Aro chief's descendant to become a dispensary assistant. She was nominated Orkney's own missionary in 1924. She even continued her work with a broken leg, where she was carried about. Drumbeats broadcast her death in 1933. She was buried next to Mary Slessor, a notable Scottish Presbyterian missionary in Nigeria, and there are memorials to her in Nigeria, as well as this plaque in St Magnus Cathedral. And of course, the first artist we have to speak about is Sylvia Wishart. She was born in Stromness. Sylvia became an internationally renowned artist, and until 1987 she was a lecturer at Grace School of Art, Aberdeen, where she decided to return, after which she decided to return home to work. Her early career wasn't quite so salubrious. She'd worked in the post office. She painted for a hobby. After some persuasion, she decided to go away. She trained as a mature student at Grace School of Art, where she returned to teach from 1969. Before that, she'd taught in Fraserburgh, Stornoway, and here in Orkney, where she used to room first in Tanganas House, and then she had a bare stone room at the Strand. She was particularly unconcerned about a place in the art world. She was happy to stay at home in Orkney and enjoy her work and involvement with like-minded friends. It was through their continual encouragement that she finally sent in some work to the Royal Scottish Academy annual exhibition, where she was made a full member in 2005. This is the pinnacle of a Scottish career. She's well known and respected across Orkney, with living rooms from North Ronaldsay to South Ronaldsay filled with her work. The paintings of her late life were often made on huge sheets of paper tacked directly to her wall. She had a preoccupation with weather and light. She was a pal of George Mackay Brown, and I like the references to their friendship, which included frequent drinking and occasional violence. They also converted to Catholicism together. Her works are found across Orkney and in the collections of Robert Gordon University, the Royal Scottish Academy, Peter Art Centre, the University of Leeds, the Scottish Maritime Museum, and the Contemporary Art Society, amongst many other institutions. 2 books have been published on her work in 2012 and 2019, and a documentary film, Reflections, The Life and Art of Sylvia Wishart, in 2011, featured interviews with her colleagues and her friends. Margaret Tate is often described as an avant-garde filmmaker and poet. Margaret Caroline Tate was also a medical doctor who trained in Edinburgh. She enlisted in 1943. She served with the Royal Army Medical Corps in the UK and the Far East until 1946, and it's here that she began to write short stories. She was stationed in India, Sri Lanka and Malaya, and she spent some time working as a locum doctor across Britain, and she extended her writing to include screenplays. In 1950, she travelled to Perugia to research a film and instead abandoned her original idea, and she enrolled at a film school in Rome for 2 years. I was going to tell you the name of the film school, but I discovered I couldn't say it. Here she formed Ancona Films with fellow student Peter Hollander. The film company was named after the street where she'd lodged in Rome. And after returning to Scotland, she lived in Edinburgh for time before she moved to Sutherland in the mid-60s and then back home to Orkney. After her graduation in Italy, Margaret made 32 short films and one full length, the one that she's best remembered for, certainly here in Orkney, Blue Black Permanent. Her films were partly funded by her continuing work as a locum. She also produced books of poetry, short stories and a Burns book, and she made watercolours, wrote a novel and took loads and loads of photos. Blue Black Permanent was made in 1992 when Margaret was 72. A documentary was shown on Channel 4 about her in 1983 called Margaret Tate, Filmmaker, in which she described her life's work as film poems. When she died at the age of 80, in April 1999, her husband Alec gifted a large amount of paperwork to the Orkney Archives, which is fully searchable. 2019 was the 100th anniversary of her birth, and there was a flurry of activity across Orkney to commemorate and celebrate her. And the website Margaret Tate 100 is still up and is a fantastic resource if you have more than a few hours to kill. In 2020, Margaret was recognised by Historic Environment Scotland under their commemorative plaque scheme celebrating noteworthy individuals from Scottish public life. And a plaque is to be erected on her birthplace at 25 Broad Street, though I don't think it's there yet. I forgot to check when I was in Campbell last week. Of note within Orkney's artistic community, there have been a huge number of impressive women, but none more so than Margaret Gardner and Barbara Hepworth, who of course were instrumental in the setting up of the Peer Arts Centre. There is an amazing amount of information on them both within the Peer Arts Centre's blog via their website if you want to find out more about them and about their contribution to Orkney's artistic scene. I have just one final category in which there are just a couple. The first, I would hope that most folk here would know where Catty Maggie's quarry is. Today, it's better known as one of the places where the Highland Park gets its water. In 1825, Robert Borwick got a licence to distill, and the land he was on was served by two strong springs of crystal clear water fed by the pool at Catty Maggie's at Greenville. You might not know the story of the name. Cast your mind back to Henrietta Greenwater. I told you she'd appear again. The book she wrote in her 80s, Memories of an Orkney Family, contained a story from her granny. So her granny was probably born in the early part of the 19th century. I tell this story when I'm tour guiding, but I thought I would actually read you the story word for word because it's been such a long since I last did a tour that I was sure that I would remember it. Like my grandfather, my grandmother was a devout Christian and never missed a Sunday at church if she was able to go, but one Sunday especially stood out in her memory. There was a half-silly, that's a mental defective, woman who earned her nickname of Catty Maggie because of the number of stray cats she collected, fed and housed. She made periodical rounds of the countryside and practically lived on the proceeds of her travels. Every year, she got from one or other of the farms she frequented the last little piglet of a litter. This she nursed with a bottle and brought up to marketing size. When she sold it and used the proceeds to keep herself and her numerous cats in food over the winter. While the piglet was young, Catty Maggie took it with her every Sunday to church, which she too attended regularly. The little pig was safely hidden under her large plaid shawl, which covered all deficiencies. On this particular Sunday, Maggie must have been paying more attention to the sermon than to the pig, for it slid down from her lap to the floor and started to run towards the gallery door, which was standing open to let in some air to the crowded church. As it ran, it called, "Gruff, gruff, gruff," and Maggie, brought back to reality by this sound, ran along the passage after it, calling, "Pat, pat, pat," and caught up with it just as it reached the top of the stairs. She lifted it up despite its protests, carried it back and sat down in her seat just as if nothing unusual had happened. The congregation did give vent to a titter here and there, but Dr. Patterson went on preaching gravely without a smile, although some declared that they could see an unusual twinkle in his eye. The Dr. Patterson will be Robert Patterson. The kirk will be today's OIC one-stop shop, so think of that the next time you're in there. Baina Carshata. Now, there's a possibility that Baina would have known Floss McNeill, as Floss was the secretary of the Scottish Suffrage Society around the time Baina was. The Orkney Women's Suffrage Society, we are told, was formed on September 25th, 1909. A meeting was held in the house of Mr. James Carshata, Daisy Bank, Kirkwall, where all the ladies present joined the association. The following month, the constitution was formally adopted and office bearers were elected. The president of the new organisation was Mrs. Beakey of Tancanas, and Mrs. McCune of Kirkle was elected vice president. The secretary was Mrs. Baina Cushiter, who offered to supply information and pamphlets on the subject. Also present were a Miss Cromarty of West End House and St Margaret's Hope. Annual subscription was set at £1 shilling. Baina Cushiter was married to James Walls Cushiter, who is listed in Who Was Who in Orkney, but Baina doesn't even make it as a footnote. The couple were living at Daisy Bank in Kirkle, and I find it a bit comical that the place where Orkney women's suffrage started is now a primping palace, where mainly, but not exclusively, women go to get their faces inflated with Botox. By this time, James is 59 and Baina is 56, and they've been married for 18 years and they had one bairn. The Orkney Herald reported that in April 1912, Dr. Elsie Ingalls, which is Honorary Secretary of the Scottish Federation of Women's Suffrage Societies, visited Orkney to address the local society, and the event took place in the Temperance Hall, Kirkle. And I quote, "The platform was tastefully decorated with flags, most prominent among which was the banner of the Orcadian Society, the work of Mr. Stanley Cushiter." Many men attended the meetings. Provost Slater chaired this one, and on the platform were a number of ladies and gentlemen who were leading local supporters of the movement. And at the meeting, Dr. Ingalls said, "Women were just as proud of the country as men, and why should they be deprived of the right of taking part in the legislation of the country?" She appealed to all to join the Orcadian Women's Suffrage Society, a society which had most enthusiastic officers. In the pamphlet, the 5th annual report of the Scottish Federation of Women's Suffrage Societies in March 1915, Orkney is actually called the Orcadian Society, and we already know that there were branches in Campbell and Stromness, so this came as a surprise. The officers were President, Mrs. Beakey, Secretary and Treasurer, Mrs. James Cushiter, and I think it's interesting that husband's name is given here rather than her own. The number of members was 106, and the number of friends, in inverted commas, was 79. And I wondered if these were men. It's difficult to make comparisons across Scotland because it's spending an awful lot more time crunching the numbers. So instead, I looked at Shetland for comparison. They had 73 members and no friends, in inverted commas. So what do we make of that? Well, that is a job for another day.